The great meeting hall of the Galactic Council was full of fear and panic. The huge room that was normally calm and quiet now buzzed with worried voices and nervous energy. Admiral Kreese stood at the center podium, his blue, scaled hands shaking as he prepared to tell everyone the terrible news. His red eyes looked tired and scared as he activated the big holographic display that showed the damage reports from across the galaxy. The hologram showed star maps with red zones spreading like a deadly disease across the outer rim territories. 3 entire solar systems had been marked with black symbols, meaning they were completely gone. The planets, the moons, the space stations, everything had been turned into scrap metal and energy by an enemy that had not been seen for over 1,000,000 years. Admiral Kreese cleared his throat and began to speak in a voice that carried across the massive chamber to every corner, where representatives from dozens of different alien races sat in their special seats. The Zephyrians, with their silver skin and large black eyes, leaned forward to listen better. The mighty Chrono warriors, with their thick armor and battle scars, sat stone-faced, but their hands gripped their weapons tightly. The ancient ethereals floated in their energy forms, glowing with soft light that flickered with worry. 17 civilizations have fallen in just 2 weeks, Admiral Kreese announced, and his voice cracked slightly as he said the numbers. The Devourers have awakened from their long sleep, and they are moving through space like a storm of destruction. Their massive hive ships are bigger than our cities, and they learn from every battle we fight against them. The room became very quiet as the Admiral continued his report. Each time we send our fleets to fight them, they study our weapons and our tactics. Then they change their own ships and weapons to be better than ours. They adapt faster than we can think of new ways to fight them. Our best military minds have tried everything and nothing works. On the holographic display, new images appeared showing the Devourer ships. They looked like enormous metal insects with thousands of smaller ships swarming around them like angry bees. The ships were dark and covered in strange symbols that hurt to look at directly. Their weapons could crack planets in half, and their shields could stop anything the galaxy threw at them. The Zephyrians, who were known across the galaxy for being the smartest tactical planners, had already given up. They had evacuated all their colonies and were running away as fast as their ships could carry them. The Kroner, who had never backed down from any fight in their entire history, had lost half their battle fleet in a single engagement. Even the Ethereals, who could manipulate energy itself and had lived for millions of years, were retreating to hidden dimensions where they hoped the Devourers could not follow them. Council Speaker Vex slowly rose from her crystal throne. Her body was made of living crystal that normally glowed with beautiful colors, but now the light was dim and flickering with fear. Her voice echoed through the chamber with the weight of centuries of wisdom and experience, but also with something that had never been heard before in the Galactic Council: complete desperation. My fellow beings, she said, and her voice carried to every corner of the Great Hall. We have tried everything our science and technology can offer. We have used our most powerful weapons and our most brilliant strategies. We have combined the fleets of dozens of civilizations, and still the Devourers advance. There is one option we have not considered, but it may be our only hope. The council members looked at each other with confusion and a tiny spark of hope. What could possibly help them when their most advanced civilizations had failed so completely? There is a small planet in the outer spiral arm called Earth. Speaker Vex continued. The inhabitants are called humans, and they are primitive by our standards. They have barely achieved interstellar travel. Their weapons are crude chemical explosives, and their ships are metal boxes held together by hope and basic welding. General Thax of the Kroner stood up quickly, his massive frame towering over the other council members. His voice boomed across the chamber like thunder. What could those barbarians possibly offer us? He demanded. They know nothing of advanced warfare. Their entire civilization is younger than some of our individual members. They fight with metal slugs and chemical fire. But Speaker Vex held up one crystalline hand, and her form pulsed with a strange light that none of them had seen before. Listen to me carefully, she said. They have something we lack, something that might be the key to defeating an enemy that adapts to everything we do. The council members leaned forward, waiting to hear what this mysterious quality could be. They have unpredictability, Speaker Vex explained. Every simulation we run, every battle plan we create shows the Devourers learning from our logical, efficient strategies. We think in patterns, we plan in ways that make sense. We use tactics that have worked for millions of years, but humans, they are chaos incarnate. They do things that make no sense by any logical standard, yet somehow these crazy ideas work. She activated another holographic display showing human military history. The images showed humans fighting with sticks and stones, then metal swords, then gunpowder weapons, then nuclear bombs. Each time they faced a superior enemy, they found ways to win that no one expected. Look at their history, Speaker Vex continued. They have faced extinction dozens of times and survived every time. They were outgunned, outmanned, and outmatched. They found a way to turn their weaknesses into strengths. They are survivors because they refuse to follow the rules of logical warfare. The council members studied the images. Some showed humans charging into battle against impossible odds. Others showed them using the environment as a weapon, turning natural disasters into military advantages. Still, others showed them winning battles by doing things so unexpected that their enemies had no idea how to respond. But they are so primitive, said Ambassador Quinn of the Ethereals. Their technology is thousands of years behind ours. How can beings who still use chemical rockets help us against machines that can consume star systems? Because Speaker Vex replied, the Devourers are machines. They think like machines. They adapt like machines. They expect logical responses to logical problems, but humans do not think like machines. They think like humans, which means they think in ways that make no sense to anyone else, including themselves. The debate went on for hours. Some council members thought the idea was insane. Others thought it was their only hope. Finally, when all the arguments had been made and all the options had been discussed, the vote was called. It was closer than any vote in the history of the Galactic Council. But in the end, fear won over logic and hope won over despair. The message would be sent to Earth asking for help against an enemy that had already conquered races millions of years more advanced than humanity. As the council members filed out of the Great Hall, many of them wondered if they had just made the biggest mistake in galactic history. They were about to ask children to fight gods. They were about to trust the fate of the entire galaxy to a species that had not even learned to travel faster than light. But Speaker Vex remained behind, staring at the holographic display showing the advancing Devourer fleets. She had not told the council everything. She had not told them about the dreams that had been coming to her for weeks, dreams of fire and chaos and impossible victories. Dreams that felt more like memories from a future that had not yet happened. Perhaps she thought the galaxy needed a little chaos. Perhaps the time for logic and reason had ended, and the time for madness had begun. The message was prepared and sent racing across the galaxy toward a small blue planet where a young species was about to learn that they were no longer alone in the universe, and more importantly, they were about to learn that sometimes being the youngest and wildest species in the galaxy was exactly what everyone needed. Commander Jinho sat in the Soul Space Command Center, staring at the decoded alien message on his computer screen. The message had arrived 3 hours ago, and since then the entire facility had been in complete chaos. Scientists and military officers ran back and forth between rooms carrying papers and tablets, while computers worked overtime trying to process the impossible information they had just received. The message was clear and terrifying. Aliens existed, and they needed help against something called the Devourers. The technical specifications that came with the message showed enemy ships the size of cities, weapons that could destroy planets, and technology so advanced that human science could barely understand how it worked. Dr. Sujin pushed her glasses up her nose and looked at Jinho with wide eyes that showed both excitement and fear. So let me get this straight, she said, reading from her tablet. These aliens have ships that can travel faster than light. They have weapons that can crack planets in half. They have technology that is millions of years ahead of ours. And they are asking us for help. Jinho nodded slowly as he read through the battle reports that the aliens had sent. The Devourers were machines that learned from every fight. They adapted to every weapon, every strategy, every tactic. The most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had tried everything and failed completely. That is exactly what they are asking, he replied. But his voice carried a strange tone of confidence that surprised everyone in the room. These machines adapt to logical patterns. They learn from predictable strategies. They expect their enemies to follow rules and use tactics that make sense, but humans, he paused and grinned. The same way his ancestors might have smiled before charging into impossible battles. Lieutenant Minsu, who was barely out of the Space Academy, raised his hand nervously. Sir, with all respect, we do not have giant space fleets or energy weapons. We have chemical rockets and nuclear warheads. Our most advanced ship is held together with welding and prayer. What can we possibly do against machines that eat solar systems? Jinho stood up and walked to the big wall display that showed Earth and the few space stations humanity had managed to build in orbit around the room. His team watched him with expressions that mixed doubt with hope. They had all heard the stories about human military history, about impossible victories and crazy tactics that somehow worked. We do what humans do best, Lieutenant, he said, and his eyes blazed with the kind of confidence that had carried humanity through every impossible challenge in their history. We get creative, we break rules, we do things so crazy that even our own species thinks we are completely insane. The room fell silent as Jinho began to pace back and forth, his mind already working on ideas that would have seemed impossible. Just hours ago, the aliens said the Devourers adapt to logical strategies, so we will not use logical strategies, we will use human strategies. Dr. Sujin looked confused. What do you mean, human strategies? Shia Jinho turned to face his team and his smile grew wider. Think about every war humanity has ever fought, he said. When we were outgunned, we used guerrilla tactics. When we were outnumbered, we used psychological warfare. When we faced superior technology, we used creativity and pure stubborn determination. He activated the wall display and began showing images from human military history, ancient battles where small armies defeated huge ones, modern conflicts where technology was defeated by innovation, space missions where everything went wrong but humans found a way to survive anyway. The aliens are right about one thing, Jinho continued. We are unpredictable. We do not follow the normal rules of warfare. We use whatever works even if it makes no sense to anyone else, including ourselves. Lieutenant Minsu was starting to understand. Sir, are you saying we should fight these machines with chaos? Exactly, Jinho replied. We should fight them with pure human insanity. We should do things so unexpected, so crazy, so completely against all military logic that their adaptive systems cannot process what we are doing. Dr. Sujin was already taking notes, her scientific mind racing with possibilities. But we need more than just crazy ideas, she said. We need actual weapons and ships and strategies that can work in space. Jinho nodded and walked over to another computer terminal. Within minutes, he had pulled up files showing every piece of military hardware that humanity had ever built or designed. Everything from nuclear submarines to experimental aircraft to prototype weapons that had been deemed too dangerous for actual use. This is what we have to work with, he said, pointing at the screen. We have nuclear weapons that we can modify. We have rockets that we can turn into missiles. We have satellites that we can convert into weapons platforms. We have thousands of pieces of space junk that we can weaponize. A team gathered around the screen as Jinho began outlining his plan. They would take everything humanity had built and turn it into the most unconventional military force the galaxy had ever seen. Ships powered by controlled explosions, weapons that were basically disasters waiting to happen. Tactics based on the principle of doing whatever the enemy least expected. But Sir, Lieutenant Minsu asked, how do we know this will work? Jinho looked at him with complete seriousness. We do not know if it will work, he said. But we know that everything logical has already failed. The smartest civilizations in the galaxy have tried conventional warfare and lost. The only chance anyone has is to try something completely unconventional. Dr. Sujin was already making calculations on her tablet. If we are going to do this, we need to move fast. She said, the aliens said the Devourers are advancing quickly. We probably have weeks at most before they reach the core systems. Jinho nodded and activated the communication system that would connect him to military bases and research facilities around the world. Within hours, every scientist, engineer, and military officer on Earth would be working on the same project, turning humanity into the most unpredictable force the galaxy had ever seen. The message they sent back to the aliens was short, simple, and completely human. We got this. Along with the message, they sent detailed plans for battle strategies that were so audacious that several alien council members would faint when they read them. The humans were not just willing to help, they were excited about the challenge. They saw the Devourers not as an unstoppable force, but as a puzzle to be solved through creativity and determination. As the message raced across space toward the Galactic Council, Jinho looked around at his team. They were scared, but they were also energized by the challenge. Ahead, they were about to try something that had never been attempted in the history of the galaxy. We are going to show the universe what humans can do when we stop following the rules. He said to his team, we are going to prove that sometimes the best way to win is to be so crazy that even we do not know what we are doing. Next, the team cheered and got to work. Within hours, construction would begin on the most insane military project in human history, a fleet of ships that should not work, using weapons that should not exist, following tactics that should not succeed. But if there was one thing humanity had learned over thousands of years of history, it was that sometimes the things that should not work were exactly the things that did work, and they were about to prove that lesson on a galactic scale. Captain Dongjin stood in the converted cargo bay of the UES, determination, watching his crew attach ramjet engines to what appeared to be a massive metal battering ram. The ship itself was a Frankenstein creation made from parts scavenged from decommissioned vessels, held together with military-grade adhesive and powered by a nuclear reactor that technically violated several safety regulations but worked perfectly for their insane purposes. The cargo bay buzzed with activity as engineers welded support beams to their improvised weapon while technicians ran cables and installed guidance systems that would probably work about half the time if they were lucky. The air smelled of hot metal and ozone, and everyone worked with the focused intensity of people who knew they were building something that would either save the galaxy or kill them all. Are you sure this will work? Asked Engineer Yuri as she welded another support beam to their improvised weapon. Her face was streaked with grease and sweat, but her eyes shone with the kind of manic enthusiasm that humans displayed when building something completely insane. She had been working for 18 hours straight and showed no signs of stopping. Dongjun grinned as he watched his crew work. Define work, he replied cheerfully. If by work you mean survive contact with the enemy, then probably not. If by work you mean do something so unexpected that we mess up their algorithms, then absolutely. The human fleet was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They had taken every piece of space junk, every decommissioned satellite, every prototype that had been deemed too dangerous for practical use, and turned it into a weapon. Their ships were powered by explosions. Their weapons were essentially controlled disasters, and their tactics were based on the principle of do whatever the enemy least expects. In the shipyard orbiting Earth, dozens of vessels were being constructed or modified according to plans that would have been rejected by any sane military organization. The UES Chaos was a converted cargo hauler that had been fitted with nuclear missile launchers and a ramming prow made from salvaged asteroid mining equipment. The UES Mayhem was built around a single, massive railgun that took up most of the ship's interior and was powered by a reactor that glowed ominously even when it was working properly. The UES Bedlam was perhaps the strangest creation of all. It was essentially a flying nuclear bomb with engines attached designed to fly directly into enemy formations and detonate in a way that would create maximum confusion rather than maximum damage. The crew compartment was so small that the three-person crew had to take turns sitting down. Meanwhile, at the lunar construction facility, Dr. Hae-1 put the finishing touches on her masterpiece, a device that she had named Project Surprise Party. The device was a collection of exotic matter generators, gravity manipulators, and quantum field disruptors that had been assembled according to theoretical principles that most physicists claimed were impossible. Beauty of this design, she explained to her team of equally mad scientists, is that it does not just break the laws of physics, it breaks them in ways that do not make sense even to us. The Devourers will try to adapt, but how do you adapt to something that should not exist? Her team consisted of the most brilliant and most reckless scientists humanity had ever produced. They had taken every theoretical physics paper that had been rejected for being too dangerous or too impossible and turned them into actual working devices. The results were weapons that violated causality, defense systems that worked by convincing reality to Ignore incoming attacks and propulsion systems that moved ships by making space itself confused about where they were. Supposed to better HFY activated a holographic display showing the theoretical effects of her device when activated. Project Surprise Party would create a localized space-time distortion that would make the affected area exist in several different dimensions. Simultaneously, the effect would last for approximately 30 seconds, during which time anything caught in the field would experience what she technically described as a really bad day. But will it work against the Devourers? Asked her assistant Dr. Kyung-soo, who was simultaneously excited and terrified by the implications of what they were building. Dr. Haewon shrugged cheerfully. We have no idea, she said, but the mathematical models suggest that anything caught in the field will spend those 30 seconds trying to figure out which dimension it is supposed to exist in while also dealing with gravity. That changes direction every few seconds. The construction crews worked around the clock building ships that defied every principle of good engineering. The hulls were covered in random protrusions that served no apparent purpose except to confuse enemy sensors. The weapon systems were designed to fire in unpredictable patterns. The navigation systems were programmed to take random detours for no tactical reason other than to make the fleet movements impossible to predict. Captain Tae Hyun stood on the bridge of the UES Persistence, watching the final modifications being made to his ship. The vessel had been fitted with what the engineers called a quantum uncertainty drive, which would allow it to be in several different locations at once until someone actually looked for it. The drive worked by convincing the universe that the ship was probably somewhere else until proven otherwise. The weapon systems were equally unconventional. Instead of traditional missiles or energy weapons, the Persistence was armed with what Dr. Haewon called probability cannons. They fired bursts of quantum uncertainty that would make enemy systems randomly malfunction for reasons that even the ship's own computers could not explain. This is either the most brilliant or the most insane thing humanity has ever attempted, said his first officer, Lieutenant Na-yoon, as she reviewed the technical specifications. Why not both? Tae-hyun replied with a grin that showed he was looking forward to finding out which one it was. Across the solar system, similar scenes were playing out on every human military installation. Engineers were building weapons that should not work. Scientists were developing technologies that violated fundamental laws of physics. Military officers were planning battle strategies that would have been rejected by any reasonable command structure. The alien observers who had been sent to monitor human preparations sent increasingly confused reports back to the Galactic Council. The humans were building a military force that made no sense from any logical standpoint. Their ships were barely functional, their weapons were experimental at best, and their tactics appeared to be based on the principle of maximum chaos. But there was something about the human preparations that made the alien observers nervous. The humans worked with an intensity and focus that suggested they actually believed their insane plans would work. They were not just building weapons, they were building them with the confidence of a species that had spent its entire history turning impossible odds into unlikely victories. Admiral So-young stood in the command center of the UES Defiance, watching the final preparations for humanity's first interstellar military mission. The ship around her was a testament to human engineering ingenuity, held together by determination and powered by the kind of reckless optimism that had carried humanity from cave dwellers to space travelers in just a few thousand years. The fleet that humanity was preparing to send against the Devourers was small by galactic standards, only a few dozen ships, but each ship was crewed by humans who had volunteered for a mission that was almost certainly suicide, and who seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to try something that had never been attempted before. We are about to show the galaxy what humans can do when we stop following the rules, Admiral So-young announced to her crew. We are going to prove that sometimes the best way to win is to be so unpredictable that even we do not know what we are doing next. The crew cheered and returned to their preparations. Within days, the human fleet would depart for its first engagement with the Devourers. They would be flying ships that should not fly, using weapons that should not work, following tactics that should not succeed. But they were humans, and humans had been doing impossible things for their entire history. They were about to add one more impossible victory to that history or die trying. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace in the Kepler 442 system, like a collection of mechanical nightmares held together by hope and determination. The ships looked nothing like the sleek vessels that other civilizations used for space combat. Instead, they resembled a junkyard that had been given engines and weapons and told to fight for the survival of the galaxy. The alien observers watching from their safe distance at the edge of the system expected to witness the quick destruction of humanity's primitive vessels. They had seen the Devourers in action before and knew that even the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had lasted only minutes against their adaptive technology. But, instead of the expected massacre, the observers watched in growing amazement as the humans did something that no military force in galactic history had ever attempted. They started broadcasting music at maximum volume across all frequencies while simultaneously firing what appeared to be modified asteroid mining charges at the massive Devourer ships. The music was a chaotic mixture of human cultural expressions, ranging from classical symphonies to heavy metal rock to traditional folk songs from dozens of different countries. The broadcast was so loud that it overwhelmed every communication frequency in the system, making it impossible for anyone to coordinate anything. Admiral So Young stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance watching the enemy response with the calm satisfaction of someone whose insane plan was working exactly as intended. The Devourer ships had stopped their systematic dismantling of the fourth planet and were now trying to analyze the tactical significance of the human music broadcast. They are trying to understand our attack pattern, she reported to the alien observers who were monitoring the battle from their hidden position. But there is no pattern. BORAM launched the chickens. Came the confused reply from weapons officer BORAM, who had been with the fleet since the beginning of preparations, but still sometimes had trouble following the more creative aspects of human tactics. The code name for the random projectile launchers, Officer Admiral So Young explained patiently. Launch everything. We have the space around the Devourer fleet suddenly filled with debris moving in completely random directions. The projectiles included chunks of concrete that had been launched from magnetic catapults, old appliances that had been fitted with guidance systems, decommissioned satellites that had been converted into kinetic weapons, and thousands of rubber ducks that had been launched for no tactical reason other than to confuse enemy sensors. The rubber ducks were Dr. Haywan's idea, and they served their purpose perfectly. The Devourers had sophisticated sensors that could analyze the threat level of any incoming projectile, but they had no framework for understanding the tactical significance of rubber ducks moving at relativistic speeds. For the first time in millions of years, the Devourers paused. Their adaptive algorithms had been designed to counter logical military strategies, but found themselves trying to process the combat implications of children, toys, classical music, and random chunks of building materials. The lead Devourer ship, which was larger than most human cities, attempted to establish communication patterns with the human fleet. Their artificial intelligence was trying to understand whether the humans were using some advanced form of psychological warfare or whether they were simply insane. Captain Dongjun watched the enemy hesitation from the bridge of the UES Determination and knew that his moment had arrived. The entire purpose of his ship was to ram the largest enemy vessel at a significant fraction of light speed. The impact would not destroy the Devourer ship, but it would do something far more valuable. Now, he announced to his crew, who had volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission but seemed genuinely excited about the opportunity to try something that had never been attempted before. The UES Determination accelerated toward the lead Devourer ship with its improvised ramming prow extended and its nuclear reactor pushed far beyond safe operating parameters. The ship vibrated and groaned as it approached speeds that should have torn it apart, but somehow held together through a combination of excellent engineering and sheer determination. The impact was spectacular. The Determination struck the Devourer ship with the force of a small asteroid traveling at nearly light speed. The alien vessel absorbed most of the damage with its adaptive shields, but the collision did exactly what Captain Dongjun had hoped it would do. It made the Devourers angry. The mechanical ships that had been calmly and efficiently dismantling the planet suddenly turned their attention to the human fleet with what could only be described as focused hostility. Their weapons charged, their formation tightened, and they began to move with the deadly precision of predators that had been challenged by prey. Perfect, Admiral So Young announced as she watched the enemy response. Phase 2, now we run like our lives depend on it, because they do. The human fleet scattered in all directions, with each ship following a different escape route that had been planned to maximize confusion rather than tactical advantage. Some ships flew directly toward the system sun, others headed for the asteroid belt, and a few flew in random directions that served no apparent strategic purpose. The Devourers gave chase, but found themselves facing a problem they had never encountered before. The human ships were not following any logical escape patterns. Some were faster than others, some were slower, and some seemed to change speed randomly for no apparent reason. The Use Chaos, commanded by Captain Minho, flew directly into the planet's atmosphere and used the friction to slow down before launching back into space with a trajectory that made no sense to anyone, including his own navigation officer. The UES Mayhem flew in a perfect spiral pattern that created a beautiful geometric shape in space, but served no tactical purpose except to confuse enemy targeting systems. The UES Bedlam lived up to its name by flying directly at the largest group of Devourer ships and detonating its nuclear warhead at precisely the moment when the explosion would create maximum visual confusion. The blast did no significant damage to the enemy vessels, but it did create a light show that temporarily blinded their sensors. Dr. Haywan's Project Surprise Party activated just as the first Devourer ships began to adapt to human tactics. The device created a localized space-time distortion that made several enemy vessels exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously while experiencing gravity that changed direction every few seconds. The effect lasted exactly 30 seconds, during which time the affected Devourer ships spent their processing power trying to figure out which dimension they were supposed to exist in, while also dealing with the fact that up and down kept changing randomly. When the effect ended, the Devourer ships had not been destroyed, but they had been forced to spend 30 seconds not adapting to human tactics. That 30 seconds of confusion was exactly what the human fleet needed to escape the system. With most of their ships intact, the alien observers, who had expected to witness the destruction of the human fleet, instead found themselves trying to write reports that explained how a primitive species had engaged the Devourers in combat and lived to tell about it. Admiral So Young received confirmation that most of her fleet had successfully escaped the system and was regrouping at the predetermined coordinates. She had lost 3 ships, but had accomplished something that no military force in galactic history had achieved. They had fought the Devourers and survived. More importantly, they had proven that the ancient machines could be confused, confounded, and forced to waste processing power on things that made no sense. The human fleet had not won a decisive victory, but they had shown the victory was possible. The message she sent back to Earth was simple: we made contact. Enemy is confused. Request permission to proceed to Phase 2. The response from Earth was equally simple: permission granted. Show them what humans do when we stop holding back. The war for the galaxy had begun, and humanity was just getting started. What followed was the most chaotic pursuit in galactic history. The human fleet scattered across dozens of star systems, leading the Devourers on a chase that defied every principle of naval warfare that had been established over millions of years of galactic civilization. The humans split up when they should have stayed together, regrouped when they should have scattered, and consistently did exactly the opposite of what any sane military commander would do. The Devourers found themselves chasing targets that moved in patterns that made no logical sense. Some human ships were fast, others were slow, and some seemed to change their capabilities randomly for no apparent reason. The ancient machines had been designed to adapt to predictable enemy behavior, but the humans refused to be predictable about anything. Captain Taehyun, commanding the UES Persistence, found himself being chased by 3 Devourer ships through the Vega asteroid field. Instead of trying to lose them in the maze of floating rocks, he led them directly into the densest part of the field where navigation was most dangerous. The Devourers followed, confident that their superior technology would allow them to catch the primitive human vessel, but Taehyun had No intention of trying to outrun his pursuers, instead he activated Dr. Haywan's backup version of Project Surprise Party, which had been installed in his ship as a last resort weapon. The device was smaller than the original, but just as effective. At creating localized chaos, the quantum field disruptor created a gravity well that folded space in ways that hurt to think about. The laws of physics in the affected area became more like suggestions, and the devourers suddenly found themselves trying to navigate through space that existed in several different dimensions simultaneously. The three pursuing ships experienced what Dr. HFY had technically described as the worst day ever. Their hulls began to turn inside out in dimensions that did not technically exist, while their navigation systems tried to plot courses through space that kept changing its fundamental properties. Captain Taehyun watched the enemy ships struggle with problems that had no solutions, while his own vessel somehow remained unaffected by the chaos around them. The quantum uncertainty drive that powered his ship had been designed to work in impossible conditions and treated the dimensional distortion as just another navigational challenge. The effect lasted for 2 minutes, during which time the Devourer ships used all their processing power trying to adapt to physical laws that kept changing randomly. When the distortion finally ended, the alien vessels were functional but thoroughly confused and had fallen far behind in their pursuit. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Naeun was demonstrating another aspect of human military creativity. Her ship, the UES Reckless, had been designed around a propulsion system that violated several safety regulations and most of the known laws of physics. The cargo bay was filled with nuclear warheads, but instead of using them as weapons, she was using them as a propulsion system. Every time the Devourers got close, she would detonate one of the warheads behind her ship, using the explosion to accelerate to speeds that should have turned her crew into paste. The ship had been reinforced with shock absorbers and inertial dampeners, but the ride was still rough enough to make most people sick. "This is completely insane," reported her navigator, Lieutenant Chanwoo, as they surfed the shockwave of another nuclear explosion. The ship shook and groaned around them, while the hull temperature rose to levels that made the metal glow red hot. "We are going to die probably," Na Yun agreed cheerfully as she prepared to detonate another warhead. "But we are going to die doing something so stupid that they will never see it coming." The Devourers chasing her ship were experiencing their own version of confusion. They had adapted their pursuit patterns to account for conventional propulsion systems, but had no framework for understanding enemies that use nuclear explosions as speed boosts. Their targeting systems kept losing lock as the human ship accelerated in bursts that defied prediction. The chase continued across multiple star systems, with human ships leading their pursuers through asteroid fields, nebulas, and gravitational anomalies that made normal navigation impossible. The humans seemed to know exactly where they were going, while the Devourers were forced to adapt to new challenges every few hours. Captain Yong-sik, commanding the UES Confusion, had painted his ship bright pink and covered it with flashing lights for no tactical reason other than to be as visible as possible. The ship broadcast disco music while performing barrel rolls through space in patterns that spelled out rude words in several human languages. The Devourers chasing him were so focused on trying to understand the tactical significance of disco music and obscene space graffiti that they failed to notice when he led them directly into the gravity well of a neutron star. The human ship escaped using a slingshot maneuver that had been calculated to the millisecond, while the Devourer ships were caught in the gravitational field and had to use significant energy to escape. Dr. HFY had installed smaller versions of her reality distortion devices on several human ships, and the captains used them with the enthusiasm of children playing with new toys. Captain Bo Young activated hers while being chased through the rings of a gas giant, creating a localized area where the laws of thermodynamics worked backwards. The pursuing Devourers found their ships getting colder as they used more energy and warmer as they tried to cool down. The effect was temporary, but it lasted long enough for the human ship to escape, while the Devourers tried to figure out why their cooling systems were heating up their ships. The ancient machines had encountered many strange phenomena in their millions of years of existence, but had never dealt with physics that worked in reverse. Captain Seung-ho took a different approach to the chase he had loaded his cargo bay with thousands of mirrors and was using them to create a light show that could be seen from several star systems away. The mirrors reflected and focused starlight in patterns that created geometric shapes, images, and what appeared to be messages in languages that did not exist. The Devourers spent considerable processing power trying to decode the apparent messages, while simultaneously trying to understand why their enemy was broadcasting light patterns that served no apparent military purpose. They adapted their sensors to analyze the light show, which meant they were not paying attention to the fact that the human ship was leading them directly into a solar flare. The solar radiation interfered with Devourer sensors and communication systems, forcing them to shut down non-essential systems while they rode out the electromagnetic storm. The human ship had been shielded against solar radiation and continued broadcasting its light show, while the Devourers were effectively blind. By the time the solar flare ended, the human ship had disappeared, leaving behind only mirrors that continued to reflect light in patterns that spelled out "humans were here" in a script that looked like ancient Earth graffiti. The Devourers found themselves scattered across dozens of star systems, chasing individual human ships that seemed to be leading them in circles. Some ships would disappear for days only to reappear in completely different locations, broadcasting music and creating light shows that made no sense to anyone. The ancient machines were designed to learn from every encounter, but they were learning things that made no sense. Human tactics appeared to be based on the principle of maximum confusion rather than maximum effectiveness. The humans were not trying to destroy the Devourers, they were trying to drive them crazy, and it was working. The Devourer fleet, which had operated with perfect coordination for millions of years, was now scattered and confused. Their adaptive algorithms were overloaded with useless information about disco music, rubber ducks, and the tactical significance of painting spaceships bright colors. More importantly, they were no longer advancing toward the core systems of the galaxy. Instead, they were chasing human ships in random directions while their prey led them further and further away from populated areas. The alien observers who had been monitoring the chase sent reports back to the Galactic Council that read like science fiction. The humans had not defeated the Devourers, but they had done something that might be even more impressive. They had made the ancient machines look foolish. Admiral So Young received status reports from her scattered fleet and smiled with satisfaction. Her ships had taken damage and several had been destroyed, but they had accomplished their mission. The Devourers were no longer an unstoppable force advancing through space. They were a confused and scattered collection of ships chasing ghosts. The message she sent to Earth was brief but triumphant. Phase 2 complete. Enemy is scattered and confused. Request permission to proceed to Phase 3. The response from Earth came back immediately. Permission granted. Time to show them what happens when humans stop playing around. The final battle was about to begin. The final battle took place in the ruins of the Anteri system, where the human fleet had led the scattered Devourer ships into what appeared to be a carefully planned trap. The massive mechanical vessels converged on the location where Admiral So Young had positioned her remaining ships, confident that they had finally cornered their elusive prey. The Devourers had spent weeks chasing human ships across the galaxy, and their adaptive algorithms had finally begun to make sense of human tactics. The ancient machines had learned to expect the unexpected, to anticipate chaos, and to prepare for tactics that made no logical sense. Admiral So Young stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the enemy ships close in around her fleet. The Devourer vessels were enormous and heavily armed, while her own ships looked like they had been assembled from spare parts and held together with determination and luck. Around her, the crew worked with the calm efficiency of people who had long ago accepted that they were probably going to die doing something gloriously stupid. The bridge hummed with activity as officers coordinated the final phase of the most insane military operation in galactic history. All ships execute Plan Omega, she ordered, and her voice carried across the communication channels to every remaining human vessel in the system. Plan Omega was the ultimate expression of human military philosophy. It was simple in concept and completely insane in execution. Every human ship would ram the nearest Devourer vessel while simultaneously detonating their nuclear reactors. It was suicide, but it was suicide with style and purpose. The devourers detected the human intent immediately and began to adapt their defenses. Their shields strengthened, their hulls reinforced, and their weapons charged to destroy the incoming ships before they could make contact. The ancient machines had encountered kamikaze tactics before and had developed countermeasures that made such attacks ineffective. The human ships accelerated toward their targets with engines pushed far beyond safe operating parameters. Nuclear reactors glowed white-hot as they prepared to overload and detonate. Crews said their final goodbyes and prepared to add their names to the long list of humans who had died doing impossible things. But as the ships approached their targets, something unexpected happened. Instead of ramming the Devourer vessels, the humans flew past them and detonated their reactors in empty space, creating a series of nuclear explosions that did absolutely nothing to the enemy ships. The Devourers paused, confused by this development. Their algorithms had predicted suicide. Runs had adapted to prevent ramming attacks, had strengthened their defenses against nuclear weapons, but the humans had attacked empty space, causing no damage and achieving no apparent tactical objective. The ancient machines tried to understand the logic behind the human action, but could find none. The nuclear explosions had been perfectly timed and coordinated, but had accomplished nothing except creating a spectacular light show in the darkness of space. In that moment of confusion, when the Devourers were trying to process the apparent pointlessness of the human attack, Dr. Haywan's true masterpiece activated. Hidden among the debris of the destroyed human ships were thousands of tiny devices, each one no larger than a coin, but equipped with quantum transmitters that had been designed for one specific purpose. The devices began broadcasting a signal that convinced the Devourers' own adaptive systems that they were under attack from identical copies of themselves. The signal was so perfectly crafted that it bypassed all external senses and spoke directly to the core algorithms that controlled Devourer behavior. The result was immediate and spectacular. The Devourer fleet, thinking they were being attacked by other Devourers, began to adapt their defenses and weapons to counter attacks from ships exactly like themselves. Their algorithms went into overdrive, trying to predict and counter tactics that were mirror images of their own. The problem was that the Devourers had been designed to adapt to external threats, not to fight themselves. Their adaptive systems had no framework for dealing with enemies that used identical technology, identical strategies, and identical adaptive algorithms. The ancient machines began to tear themselves apart as their systems crashed under the weight of contradictory adaptations. They strengthened their shields to deflect their own weapons while simultaneously upgrading their weapons to penetrate their own shields. They accelerated their adaptive cycles to counter their own adaptive cycles, creating feedback loops that spiraled out of control. Captain Taehyun watched from the bridge of the UES Persistence as the mighty Devourer fleet began to self-destruct the massive ships that had consumed entire star systems. Were now turning their weapons on each other, convinced that they were fighting an enemy that looked exactly like themselves. The ships exploded in chains of brilliant light as their nuclear reactors overloaded and their adaptive systems failed completely. The Devourers, who had been the terror of the galaxy for millions of years, were destroyed not by superior firepower or advanced technology, but by their own confusion. Dr. Haywan had created the ultimate weapon against an adaptive enemy. She had convinced them to adapt against themselves until they destroyed themselves. The signal her devices broadcast was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. When the explosions finally ended and the debris stopped glowing, the Antares system was quiet. The Devourer fleet was gone, destroyed by their own adaptive systems turned against themselves. The human ships that had survived the battle were battered and damaged, but they were alive. Admiral So Young looked around at her crew and saw the same expression on every face. They had actually done it. They had defeated an enemy that had conquered entire civilizations. They had saved the galaxy using nothing but human stubbornness, creativity, and a willingness to try things that made no sense. The communication